Every now and then, a person may come across a film that lures them in and manages to become such a remarkable experience for the viewer in question, it sticks with them for such a long time. For me, one movie that managed to achieve this, and even more so, is The Iron Giant. Released in 1999 and loosely based off of the 1968 novel The Iron Man by Ted Hughes, The Iron Giant follows the story of Hogarth Hughes, a misunderstood yet gifted young boy who lives with his mother Annie in the small town of Rockwell, Maine in 1957. Locked in his own world of black and white monster movies and long travels in and around the town on his bike, Hogarth soon becomes fascinated by growing town rumors of a strange giant monster made out of metal, supposedly crash landing off the coast of the town and who may be wandering in the nearby woods. Later that night, as he is home alone, his television reception is rudely disrupted and decides to investigate, equipping himself with his BB gun and running into the forest area surrounding his home. There, he finds evidence that something large has been lurking there, and he even stumbles upon a silhouetted path in the shape of an abnormally tall humanoid. Immediately, Hogarth makes his first encounter with the Iron Giant, an extraterrestrial war machine constructed to wipe out any civilization it is shipped off to. Hogarth runs from the giant yet sympathizes with it once he sees the giant become trapped in electrical cords, propelling Hogarth to deactivate the power station and save it from likely destruction. After being startled by the giant suddenly awaking after falling down, he happens to run into his mother, who drives home an astonished Hogarth. Following the ordeal, Hogarth struggles to get the giant out of his head and ends up traveling back to the same woods to encounter the giant yet again. In doing so, he is once again frightened, yet quickly forms a bond with the giant, after realizing he is more harmless than the rumors and his wild imagination made it out to be, even going as far as to teach it.
That's right!
Since the giant realizes Hogarth saved its life earlier in the film, he grows attached to him, even following Hogarth around the wooded landscape until, due to its hunger, the giant tries to eat a stretch of train tracks, only to attempt to repair it once Hogarth demands it to, as an oncoming train strikes the giant, severing it in many different pieces. Amazingly, the giant repairs itself as Hogarth increasingly struggles to keep the giant a secret in the small town, let alone from his own mother, with Hogarth doing all he can to emphasize to the giant that he is good rather than evil and malevolent. They soon head to McCoppin's scrap as a means to quench the metal-based hunger of the Iron Giant, and soon bump into Dean McCoppin, the owner of the junkyard. Dean cozies up to Hogarth, yet is shocked by the giant, being unable to believe what he is seeing as a giant robot from outer space makes a buffet out of his junkyard. Initially reluctant, Dean allows for the giant to stay, though only for the night. Meanwhile, a government agent named Kent Mansley is sent from Washington to investigate the reports of a giant metal man in Rockwell, and though skeptical during the beginning of his investigation, comes to find that there truly is a large entity wandering on the outskirts of town, and even begins to suspect Hogarth after visiting his home to make an emergency telephone call when suspicions begin to mount upon finding Hogarth's damaged BB gun in the woods.
See anything unusual, Hogarth?
Gotta use the bathroom.
Mansley then manages to rent out the room in Hogarth's house just so he can squeeze information out of him, but grows more desperate as time goes on, making it more difficult for Hogarth and Dean to conceal the giant. At the same time, the giant gradually develops humanistic traits, becoming more articulate and kind as Hogarth reiterates that the giant is friendly and stands for the side of good rather than evil, even expressing to the giant that while it isn't bad to die, it is never good to kill and that souls don't die, notions that the giant firmly accepts without question. Mansley's desperation only becomes more evident when he interrogates Hogarth in the shed by his home, demanding to know where the giant is. Giving in out of understandable fear, Hogarth reveals the giant's whereabouts, only for Dean to think ahead and pretend that the giant is one of his many sculptures after the army arrives to the junkyard to destroy the giant. As a mutual sigh of relief overtake Hogarth and Dean, the giant, automatically giving into its internal destructive system as a programmed killing machine, confuses Hogarth's playful toy gun pointing for a genuine threat, nearly killing Hogarth, causing great scorn from Dean, which prompts the giant to run away. The giant quickly redeems himself by saving 2 children that nearly fell to their deaths in the middle of Rockwell after spotting the giant from a roof, instantly becoming a hero for the town. Spotting the giant during their hasty withdrawal, the military immediately fires upon it, causing the giant to escape yet again while also refraining from destroying any tanks or firing at fighter jets until it is shot down with Hogarth still in his hand, leading to the giant to compose itself afterwards only to find what appears to be a lifeless Hogarth lying before him. Enraged once the military fires at it yet again, the giant transforms into the dangerous weapon it is supposedly meant to be, wiping out tanks and heading towards the town in classic giant monster movie rampage fashion. Once in Rockwell, the military contemplates luring the giant outside of the town to attack it with a nuclear warhead on standby, but matters are complicated once Hogarth runs to the giant and attempts to reason with it.
No, wait! It's me! Hogarth, remember?
Finally bringing the giant to composure as the giant manages to finally and definitively overcome the evil within itself, Celebration is cut short when Mansley orders for the missile to be launched without the general's permission, leading for the Giant to save the citizens of Rockwell by flying up to the missile before giving last words to Hogarth.
You stay, I go, no following.
The Giant collides with the missile, saving the town yet sacrificing itself in the process. Later, Hogarth is given what the military states is the sole piece recovered from the Giant's remains, and later that night, the piece exits his bedroom to begin its journey to Iceland, where the Giant is still alive and repairing itself after all. Despite its poor box office showing, largely due to faulty marketing, the Iron Giant has grown into a celebrated cult classic, and its charm continues to touch many even well after 20 years since its release. A compelling plot and setting, a great score by Michael Kamen, and an immersive 2D animation style complemented by the CGI giant which only allows it to look otherworldly compared to everything else surrounding it are only some of the many factors of the film that make it highly enjoyable. But the film's strongest qualities are hidden below the surface of a qualitative animation style and heartfelt adventure. Years before the film's release, director Brad Bird pitched the idea of the Iron Giant to executives at Warner Brothers, who were originally intending on releasing the project as a musical. Dissatisfied with a musical take on a book that deeply touched him, Bird had different ideas when he entered the project still reeling from a family tragedy in the form of the killing of his sister Susan at the hand of her husband who committed the senseless murder with a gun. As a result, Bird's pitch to the executives was, what if a gun had a soul and didn't want to be a gun? The idea that a gun could escape its primary and basic purpose in favor of becoming something greater became the central theme of the Iron Giant, a theme only exemplified by the ever-growing connection between Hogarth and the Giant seen throughout the film and its relationship with change. The beginning of such a powerful bond between Hogarth and the Giant can be traced back to their very first interaction, when Hogarth deactivates the electrical power station after seeing the Giant get caught in the station's cords. Despite being distant from each other for an entire night following the event, Hogarth reunites with a Giant that now instantly recognizes and acknowledges the fact that Hogarth saved him from certain doom, painting Hogarth as an ally to the Giant rather than the type of enemy the Giant was initially programmed to eradicate in the first place. This kickstarts their robust friendship that would last throughout the rest of the film, a friendship that would see the Giant develop human characteristics and appreciate the value of human life the more he is exposed to Hogarth's humanity that finds itself blanketed by his childish innocence. This change in the Giant's behavior, as later evidenced by the unwillingness for him to shoot down fighter jets or engage in violence for no clear reason other than for reasons of self-defense, is reflective of the universal truth that there is a chance in which anyone, regardless of how corrupt or malevolent, can be saved from evil and be brought towards good, especially if they accept change out of free will. A free will that the Giant develops because of the friendly human characters that surround him in contrast to a more selfish character that crafted a bad example to the human race in the Giant's eyes. With such a contrast, the Giant could tell that the perpetual war between good and evil does exist and opts for good, neglecting his designs and supposed purposes of being a destructive force into a figure of kindness. One scene that expertly displays this is when Hogarth introduces comic books for him and the Giant to read. During the scene, the Giant notices a comic book with a character named Atomo, a rampaging robot seen destroying the human race, which suits the purposes of the mechanical race that the Giant stems from. However, Hogarth assures him that he is much more like Superman, a comment that resonates with the Giant and paves the way for his discovery of good, as seen later in the film when the Giant attaches a large S symbol onto its chest in Dean's junkyard, and mimics Superman. Yet, not only does the Giant see a radical change throughout the film in favor of promoting benevolence and peace, but the character development of Hogarth himself also sees a dramatic shift for the better. Throughout the film, Hogarth shows glaring signs of being socially distant according to the choices he makes. As opposed to spending time with friends in the evening, he immerses himself in the endearing world of classic science fiction and B-movies and constantly befriends animals he finds in the woods near his home. This social distance finds itself to be a product of Hogarth's intelligence, as his classmates and other kids in his grade altogether continuously mock and bully him. Envious of his intellect and curiosity, as well as the fact that he was moved up a grade, as Hogarth, unlike most students, took pride in outdoing himself as far as schoolwork was involved. By the end of the film, however, after the Giant sacrifices himself, Hogarth is seen playing with school friends, a large contrast to the more reserved and isolated Hogarth we came to know and appreciate as an audience, indicating that just as Hogarth's benign and kind personality molded the Giant's personality helped Hogarth become a Giant in his own right, a Giant of courage, determination, and bravery. Still, while Hogarth and the Giant both allow one another to develop as characters and ultimately as living beings pursuing the way of good over evil, Kent Mansley, the government agent sent to track the Giant, acts solely out of self-interest. To Mansley, the Giant is a menace regardless of how friendly he may be, since if the Giant is destroyed or somehow incapacitated under the guise of his investigation in Rockwell, he will be celebrated and crowned nationwide as the government agent that saved the country from a menace he believes to be of foreign origin. Considering the Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite that just so happened to be launched into space right before the Giant crash lands to Earth, Mansley refuses to take any chances out of his bloated ego. From manipulating his superior to deploy a large military force to stop the Giant to his outright lie that the Giant killed Hogarth during the standoff when in fact this never occurred, Mansley is greatly symbolic of the dogged and ruthless approach in which the Cold War-era US government prioritized taking extreme measures to root out all that it saw threatening or unexplained, pointing fingers at an overseas enemy that sought to infiltrate an idyllic American lifestyle. One example of Mansley's fanatical paranoia occurs when Mansley, out of desperation, locks Hogarth in the shed by his home and interrogates him, with Hogarth refusing to provide evidence of the Giant's existence until Mansley threatens that he may be taken away from his mother if he fails to comply. This conflict between the two shows that while Mansley represents the paranoid essence of the government and society, Hogarth reflects the overwhelming curiosity held by millions of children across the US who especially look to the stars and coming space race with enormous wonder rather than great unease. Mansley's evil nature comes to fruition throughout the film as he seeks to take advantage of the paranoia that gripped American society at the time for his own gain, a gamble that would lead to his frankly embarrassing downfall in the end. By putting himself above others even as he tries to flee once the nuclear missile is launched at Rockwell's direction, Mansley does all he can to destroy the Giant out of the very same sheer destructive evils that Hogarth warns the Giant against as the film unfolds. Mansley's failure in annihilating the Giant even after exploiting the kindness of Hogarth's mother Annie and the patriotic fervor of the general displays the dangerous limits of acting out of self-interest, as selfishness can very well consume those that are already so self-absorbed, and especially at the expense of the trust and sentiments held by those around them. Aside from being consumed, self-absorption leads to other dangers. By dwelling in a self-centered and egotistical mindset, the chances of rebuilding after suffering a major setback only dwindle as Mansley demonstrates, considering the inevitable decaying of his career as a result of the Giant's heroic sacrifice. For the Giant, however, each time he gets destroyed and disassembles, whether as a result of an oncoming train or nuclear missile, he only manages to rebuild himself at the end, reflecting the perseverance of someone that stands for the forces of good that only seek to strengthen those that seek it as opposed to weaken and destroy. The Giant's ability to repair itself coincides with his growing sense of humanity, as persevering remains a massive part of life for the average human being. When pitching his take for the Iron Giant to studio executives at Warner Brothers, Brad Bird crafted his adaptation of Ted Hughes' original story by connecting Hughes' life to his own, since Ted Hughes initially wrote the story as a means to comfort his children following the loss of their mother Sylvia Plath, a famous poet who ultimately took her own life, to Bird's tragedy of losing his sister to a gun-wielding husband. And, like Hughes, Bird simply continued on with his life, pushing through regardless of the trials and difficult periods that awaited him, piecing himself back together after enduring large time frames of grief, as the Iron Giant pieced itself together following its head-on collision with a missile designed to destroy and kill. While the Iron Giant is host to an array of thematic elements and symbols that only make the film more appealing, I always found myself gravitating towards the film for a number of personal reasons as well. As a kid, I would stay up late to do nothing but watch classic monster and sci-fi films from the 1950s, and though they were obviously released well before my time, they captured my imagination and captivated me in ways in which no other movies did at the time, or even since, instilling a love and appreciation for such films within me that still persists today. Giant insects, alien invaders, monsters created by scientific experiments gone wrong, and creatures born from radiation were all plot types that served as reflections of the real-world fears gripping the public at the time, such as espionage and its relationship with the unknown, or the threat of nuclear annihilation. The Iron Giant serves as both a direct result of such films, as well as one of the best examples of their collective influence, so much so that it essentially is a 1950s sci-fi film except animated and released decades after such films were incredibly popular, even subtly referencing certain films from the era, including the original The Day the Earth Stood Still and the War of the Worlds films, all in one scene when the Giant transforms into the weapon of mass destruction it was built to be after being attacked by the military. The plot places a 50-foot robot right in the middle of a small town during a period of both innocence and anxiety, a mirror image of the films of the Atomic Age it was modeled after. On top of that, Hogarth even has a poster to 1956's Forbidden Planet in his room, a fitting Easter egg considering Forbidden Planet is highly regarded as arguably the most influential science fiction movie ever made, paving the way for future franchises of the genre including Star Trek and Star Wars. Speaking of Hogarth, his character has always resonated with me on more than one level. Like Hogarth, I always found myself to be distant from those around me even at a young age, as I valued my interests even more than excessive social interaction. Interests that included staying up whole nights to watch monster movies as Hogarth does. Like Hogarth, I held an open mind towards the unknown, hoping and believing that something else might be out there even as others mocked and joked. His character simply serves as a mirror for me whenever I watch the film, allowing me to stare back at my childhood as well as reason further with the characteristics that I continue to hold on to even in the present. All in all, The Iron Giant, despite its almost quiet release in 1999, has grown into a beloved masterpiece with many feeling touched by its endearing nature and robust story, enabling the film to remain a phenomenon for many years to come. With its memorable themes of battling against evil for the pursuit of changing in favor of good, the dangerous limitations and risks of self-interest, the necessity of rebuilding after being struck with tragedy or failure, as well as the personal reasons mentioned, all serve as grounds as to why I consider The Iron Giant to be my favorite film of all time.